next most recent thing I made was Synesthesia, which is my first attempt at making color bass. Really, even though that's something I've always wanted to make, this is also the first track I made on my PC. Before this point, I was using my laptop, which is garbage. By this point, I actually lost count. I think 9 years old? 9 going on 10 years old. So yeah, not a great computer for making music on, obviously. So yeah, it was really rough trying to get by on my laptop. And one of the biggest things is that to make color bass, there's a certain plugin I have to use a lot of called Vocodex. And of course, Vocodex takes up a lot of your CPU. So in previous tracks, even though I loved Vocodex, I can only really use 1 or 2 before the project would start grinding to a halt on my laptop. Whereas here, now I had my PC, I could use as many as I wanted. So of course the first thing I made was color bass, since that's something I'd always wanted to make, but I just couldn't, literally physically could not get enough Vocodexes in a project without it constantly crashing. So here I just took advantage of that. I just thought, finally, I can spam Vocodex. And so I made this track. I'm gonna start playing it now while I keep talking over it. So yeah, this track, I'm still very proud of it, and honestly, despite what I've said, I actually think that in terms of my preference, I still think Synesthesia is my magnum opus, or something like that. Just like the best track that I've made in my own opinion so far. I think that Solstice, I feel like it's more polished, but in terms of actual personal preference, I'd still say this is my favourite track I've made. This, I did have some pretty good mastering in it compared to what I had before. I made a real effort to improve the mastering with this track. But it is still a little bit on the aggressive side, and to be honest, when I first made this track, I didn't even notice. Like, it didn't even occur to me that this was aggressive in the mastering department, but just because I guess it was less aggressive than stuff I've made in the past, I thought that this sounded, if anything, maybe a little bit too much like I held back on the volume, but in hindsight, no. This, if anything, is a little bit still leaning towards the aggressive side. But still, I think that aggressiveness does add a lot of energy to this track, and that's really what's trying to get it gotten across here. This is supposed to be very high energy, very just kind of enjoyable. I mean, it's called synesthesia. If you're not aware of what synesthesia is, it's essentially a psychological thing where you associate colours with abstract concepts, and to some people it even means they literally like can taste colours or something like that, weird stuff like that. However, that's not what I mean when I say synesthesia here. I have something called associative synesthesia, which is, well, the type where you simply, whenever you hear of an abstract concept or a word, for some reason you just associate a colour with it. There's not necessarily any logic to it. Sometimes there's a bit of logic, sometimes it's literally just random. So a good way that I can put it is, I can't tell you why, but if anyone says the word March, I would think of the colour light blue. Can't tell you why, I just do. And so that, as you can imagine, really actually influences my music a decent amount, because any sounds I make, instantly I just think of a colour when I make them. And so, as you can imagine, since literally the genre I was trying to produce here is colour bass, and this is my first attempt at it, I thought, hey, why don't I make a track called Synesthesia? And essentially, I just wanted to make a track that set off my synesthesia as hard as possible, that just made me think of so many colours when, you know, I heard it, and so that's what this is. It's a track that I really focused on trying to make it intensely just feel super colourful in my mind. And I think that I nailed that, really. But of course, that's a very kind of personal thing, since, you know, I doubt I got that many other synesthesia enjoyers in my audience. But yeah, this, as you can tell, though, does get very elaborate, and I really shot myself in the foot here in terms of trying to give myself like the hardest time possible making this mastering good. There is a moment in the second drop where, if I remember right, there are over 7 overlapping basses at once on top of the already existing drums and arpeggio. And I have to make them all cut through the mix and be audible, like, relatively clearly, all in their own different ways. And it was a nightmare, as you can imagine, doing that. It involved a lot of very complex techniques, and I spent a lot of time not even making new sounds, but just trying to get old sounds to be balanced well. So yeah, this track is pretty elaborate, but that's kind of why I love it, of course. And overall, I'm very proud of it, although I still think I made a few mistakes. Like, for instance, so far this is all fine, but we're going to get to the ending of this track soon, and I have to admit, honestly, I feel like I dropped the ball with the ending here. When I first made this, I thought this was fine, I really like this melody that comes in the second section that I made. Like, I really liked it. And I'd heard it on repeat for ages because I was just in the, project working on this track for ages, so I've heard this melody so many times. And I have had a problem before. Not a big problem, it's not a big issue. But occasionally I'll make a melody I really like in a track, and it will actually only be used once in a really brief moment. But I kind of won't realise how little it's used because I've had to listen to that melody for hours and hours over and over and over while making it. Because, I don't listen to the whole track as a whole, I'm listening to each part as I make it. So if I spend an hour making one little melody part, then I'm going to hear that on loop for an hour. And so it's going to sound to me like, oh yeah, I use that a hell of a lot, but then in reality, I might barely ever use it in the actual project. So, of course, I thought to myself, well, I really like this melody, and it feels like I'm using it a lot, but actually, I'm not using it that much. Maybe I should repeat it more, but I think I went too overboard in the other direction there, where it gets a bit obnoxious the amount of times it repeats at the end. Especially since the instrument doesn't really change. I must admit, I kind of chickened out almost a little bit. If I skip back to the ending for a moment, I did make other sounds that do this sort of melody, but for the most part, they're too quiet to really be clearly heard. And I kind of did that on purpose, because to be honest, I thought the new sounds didn't sound as good as the old ones. So I thought, I'll put them in, but I'll keep them relatively quiet so they don't really get in the way. But if anything, I feel like I should have just committed to one or the other in hindsight. I feel like that is one of the major mistakes I made in this track. But overall, as I say, I'm quite happy with how this went. Also, if we go back to the intro, I suppose the other thing that bothers me about this track is that, undeniably, I feel like one of my things that might put some people off, is that I tend to go for some really complicated stuff. And so I thought to myself, hey, you know what? Some people think I should just make more basic stuff. What if I just made a really basic intro here and just make it sound good and just really basic? And I'm not gonna lie, in hindsight, I kind of wish I didn't do this. I think this intro works fine enough, but I really wish I did more for it. I kind of told myself, no, don't do any more because, people aren't going to like it. But in hindsight, I think this would have been better if I did add more details to this intro, and I do think it is a little bit barren. But I just thought at the time, I overdo it usually, so let me just go for something a little bit more simplistic. But overall, still, pretty happy with how this turned out. So let's move on to where things get really interesting, where I start covering the tracks from quite a few years ago, the tracks that I made for Avian Omens.